Welcome to the first of our 4 keynote sessions, and I have the distinct pleasure of introducing Peter Sondergaard. Peter Sondergaard was Executive Vice President and member of Gartner's Operating Committee for 15 years. He transformed the company's research and advisory organization through multiple acquisitions. The organization now addresses mission-critical priorities of the CEO and every functional leader in the enterprise. The Gartner Research and Advisory Organization includes 2,500 research analysts and advisors with deep expertise in IT, marketing, supply chain, HR, finance, sales, and legal, and serve tens of thousands of enterprises in more than 90 countries around the world. Mr. Sondergaard is a sought-after keynote speaker and industry thought leader, quoted frequently in the New York Times, the Financial Times, the Wall Street Journal, The Economist, and CNBC. He covers topics such as evolution of digital business, the impact of emerging technologies, artificial intelligence, and the technology's impact on talent and work. Prior to his global position at Gartner, Mr. Sondergaard led the Gartner Research Group in Europe, following roles increasing in seniority at International Data Corporation and Scandinavian Airlines System. Peter holds a master's degree in economics from the University of Copenhagen and is fluent in 6 languages. Mr. Sondergaard founded the Sondergaard Group, which focuses on advising senior executives around digital transformation, go-to-market strategies, and driving growth in a technology-led society. Additionally, he is an investor and advisor to numerous technology companies, primarily in the software and artificial intelligence areas. Ladies and gentlemen, it gives me great pleasure to give you Mr. Peter Sondergaard. Peter, over to you.
Andre, thank you very much for those kind words. And also, good morning, everybody, and welcome to this session. We've obviously been talking about digitalization for what is probably about 20 years. And we also have to remind ourselves that prior to that, we actually talked about e-business. And before that, it was really about the usage of technology. So what we are going to cover today is not so much disruption. It's more a question of a natural evolution, a maturity of what is digitalization for all of us in this virtual room. And what no better than perhaps to start with a couple of interesting quotes that kind of sets the stage for the session over the next 40 minutes. First, you will see on your left-hand side is a very famous quote from 2011 from Mark Andreessen, which fairly accurately stated that software is eating the world. And while we all may think that that is a case of software companies being dominant, it's actually much broader than that. It is that all of us are, in fact, software companies. And that's really the gist of the second quote here, is that every company is a software company, irrespective of whether you sell software. You are always going to be designing towards an environment in which your products, your processes, and your people are designed around software, and we will talk about that. Now, the foundation of that, the foundation of our digital economy that we work towards is that of data, and it is no secret either for all of you that data essentially is the oil of the 21st century. And analytics, machine learning, artificial intelligence is our combustion engine, because in essence, that data has no value until we turn it into some sort of value, no different than the difference between oil and then gasoline used in cars that actually propel a car forward, at least in the dying breed of gasoline-powered cars. So these quotes, I think, synthesize what all of you are focused on, which is essentially to design a software-based world that defines your organization within a software-defined society upon which data and the ability to turn that data into value is essentially what our work will be about over the course of the next 10, 20, even 30 years. Now, it is a changing world that we operate in, and I think it is important to state we are seeing in this next stage of digitalization disruptions everywhere around us, disruptions that define what we do as businesses, and that also therefore will define what we do as organizations going forward when it comes to digitalization. We are all very aware of the consequences of the supply chain disruptions, which has had some massive and very disastrous impacts for all economies across the world, but has a more long-term and sustainable impact in that we are thinking about how we have and will and should define our supply chains as we move into the future. We know that our business models, the ones that for some of you, you have maybe operated for hundreds of years, are in fact in the midst of changing, whether it is in the financial services area, whether it is in the manufacturing area, or for that matter of fact, maybe the most stable organizational structures of the world, governments, is that it is changing the way governments operate. So our business models are being disrupted as we speak. We face an enormous challenge in terms of energy price disruption. And while there is a certain aspect of this that may be deemed as short term, I think this is also a precursor to what is likely going to be a constant for us, is the volatility of energy prices will be all around us for the next many, many years, and therefore require response. Climate change, as we all know, impacts us in every which way or form and wherever we are. I will tell you, I am about 5 minutes walk from the beach, a beach that I know 20 years ago was much larger. And I know that beach, and trust me, since I'm sitting in Denmark, we can't afford much more rise of sea levels because the highest point here in this country is only 140 meters. So therefore, there is no room for anything that happens with regards to rising sea levels, and more broadly, of course, climate disruption actually affects all of us in various forms. We have political disruptions, of which, of course, we are seeing one right now in Europe with the war in Ukraine. But we can assume as leaders that we are going to face disruption as an ongoing aspect when it comes to political aspects of our lives. And then last but not least, we've had a disruption in terms of how we work, which has had tremendous consequences, not just sitting on a Zoom call like this, but more so in terms of the availability of skills, the need for perhaps locating things in a more distributed manner. So we have to assume that digitalization as we move forward is going to be governed by a world in which there will be a constant set of disruptions, not necessarily just the ones we have seen right now. And in that disruption, we do have to then, as we think about what are our actions when it comes to digitalizing our organization going forward, we do need to think about where is technology moving? And it's always an interesting thought experiment to perhaps ask ourselves, number one, what are the most important technologies? And what happens when they are pervasive? And more so, let's try to extrapolate that pervasiveness maybe 10 or 20 years out. Now, I put myself to that challenge and said, okay, well, I'm going to try to do this in one slide, which of course is impossible, as all of you know, but at least let's try to take some of the major things and then ask ourselves, what happens? What happens when artificial intelligence is not something you just talk about, or is an interesting POC that you run in your organization, but that it is pervasive in anything you do. Anything that we do as human beings will become supported by artificial intelligence. And so what happens in a world in which AI is essentially pervasive to the edge of what we deem as the digital fabric of society, the digital fabric of your organization? Secondly, what happens when cloud is in fact pervasive everywhere, in not just in terms of moving certain workloads to the cloud, but in essence, that cloud is moved all the way to the edge of our infrastructures, governing the products that we may produce, the products we may use, governing the services that we design. And third, what happens if we actually do have the bandwidth, the massive pipes that allow us to do things that we cannot do today? What happens then? Remember, your car, if you bought a new one recently, has a truckload of cameras installed that generates petabytes of data every week that is in fact shed every week because you don't really do anything with it. But imagine that we could actually transport the important aspect of that to a place in which it could be analyzed. What business models open up? What opportunities happen for you as the consumer? And obviously, more importantly, what happens in society when that is possible? Fourth is, and now you appreciate that this is perhaps something which is more long-term, is what happens when, at least at the center of that fabric, quantum computing becomes an element of, not necessarily, because that will not happen the next 10 or 15 years, the totality of what we do, but at the center of the fabric of what we do. What happens with compute infrastructures and the possibilities that it allows us to achieve? And then last but not least, what happens if we solve one of the fundamental problems that we have with digitalization, which is we don't have enough developers. And we likely may never have enough developers if we continue at the current pace and path and method that we use to educate developers, because the time it takes to turn out artificial intelligence and machine language aware data scientists to satisfy the needs of your organization, we will all not be on this earth when that happens. And so we need to look at this differently. And therefore, we have to ask ourselves the question, why don't we turn everybody into developers? And I will talk about that later, because that is in fact the next path, turning everyone into developers, and thereby ensuring that we now are only limited by our creativity, by the leadership in the organization, and the ability to then deploy the technologies, as opposed to being constrained about using the technology simply because we do not have enough. Now, of course, there are other technologies. There will be many of you in the room now that will be sitting there saying, but what about this? What about that? What about blockchain? What about other things? And yes, there are a myriad of technologies if you talk about emerging technologies, but imagine these fives as pervasive everywhere. Then, of course, we have to wrap that in a security environment that allows us to do this in a secure manner, which is equally a challenge, especially because we are now looking at these five technologies evolving to pervasiveness. Now, here's the interesting point, because if we look at this from a business perspective, there are essentially three things that we can then talk about is the long-term evolution of what we do. The first is that world of these technologies over the next 10, 15, 20 years evolves into a world of autonomous, sustainable products. Autonomous, sustainable products, products that act on them by themselves, using the technology, products that are sustainable because in essence, they are circular in nature. They are an instance of digital twins because every physical product will have a virtual instance of itself. And of course, it makes robotics pervasive. That world changes the opportunity for business, and that is one of three pillars of shifts that happen as a result of the long-range changes with regards to digitalization. The second, automated composable processes. In essence, that we have products and services that we manufacture, but the entity that does so is in essence a digital instance of itself. It has fully automated and composable processes that can be reconfigured by individuals and attached to digital ecosystems and operate in the digital society that we now would call our new future society. And then third and last is if we are replicating products in digital instances, organizations and their processes in digital instances, we should also expect that we are replicating human beings so that each of us, imagine this, will run around with at least a person or personal NFT of ourselves, one that we can use in the digital world we operate, and one that may in fact then replicate or be different from the person that we may be in the physical world. And yes, for those of you that are sitting there saying, but wait a minute, I've heard about this, isn't that the metaverse? Yeah, you could say that that would be an element of this, but digital humans is so far more than what I think the constrained definition of the metaverse is today, in essence, because it incorporates some of the technologies that you see below. So we may in fact have a much smarter version of ourselves, AI, a version that exists in the cloud and can be transported everywhere, and in fact can solve things for people in its digital format and help with the automated processes or the creation of new autonomous sustainable products. So in many ways, while this is depicted as, shall we say, a line, it's circular because the digital human may in fact connect back over to the autonomous sustainable products, because in essence, we're really talking about us being robots, but there's an instance of ourselves there. That is digitalization. As we move forward, it is about people, processes, and products. And that is what we are designing for over the course of the next 10, 15, 20 years. But then we have to stop. And we have to go back to now. And we have to understand, what is it in fact that defines us today? What is our digital maturity today? And one recommendation that I would really like you to take from this session is you should go back and think a little bit about, where are you on the scale of digital maturity? Because most of us kind of see the world as almost binary when we talk about digitalization, either that we're digitalizing or now we have digitalized, and that's actually not true. There are multiple generations of digitalization. I would envisage that the majority of the audience here is somewhere between generation 2 and generation 3. Generation 1 was where we put in the traditional back office systems that we all know, the ERP systems, the CRM systems. Generation 2 is in essence where we start to connect these better. You can kind of imagine this as being the same thing as building a house. You've laid a foundation, which is a digital foundation for what happens inside your organization. Now in generation 3, you start to think about products from a digital first perspective. You create new services in new ways. And also that changes the role of the IT organization. They switch between generation 2 and generation 3 is something that many companies actually struggle with, because that is not an easy change. But the house now has walls. It likely may even be close to having a house. Then you start to think about, how do I grow into a generation 4, which is now where you think about the world from a customer outside in perspective. You're using digital technologies to, in essence, build your products and services, and you're starting to build unique instances of that and connect out to other entities in your supply chain, value chain, and with your customers. So your house now exists as a house on the street. And the people on the street also have fully digital houses. This is why very few companies are generation 4, because they haven't yet themselves got there, and the people around them in their supply chain or in their customer base are not there either. And ultimately, we go towards a generation 5 in which we're now thinking about digital technologies from a personalized, proactive perspective, either towards customers or to suppliers, in which we have now put in the plumbing infrastructure around what would be a city, as you see the house analogy on the right-hand side. I would encourage you to think about, how do you in your organization articulate what your digital maturity is? And one important aspect that I believe is critical for leadership going forward now is that we all have a common language for what digitalization is. I bet you, if you ask every leader in your company or organization right now, they will have just as many answers about what digitalization in your company is as people you ask. And that is an inhibitor for how we now progress the digital process that has been underway. And boy, has it been underway, because during the pandemic over the last couple of years, one could argue, did we increase digitalization? Yes. Was it what we wanted? No. Was it our strategy? No. But it did improve certain aspects. But now is the time to actually go back and revisit, how does digitalization fit within your overall organizational strategy? Because keep in mind, digitalization is not a separate strategy to your organizational strategy. You can only have one strategy. So digitalization now has to appear inside your overall organizational strategy. And yes, over the course of the last 2 years, 2 very hard years, both for many of us personally, and also for us as organizations, where we did clearly look at a shift with the digital workplace, clearly looked at automation technologies for processes, simply because we didn't have the people there. And trust me, that trend is going to accelerate now as a result of the skills shortage that exists across the globe, and as well as risk mitigation in our supply chain environments. Is we need to solve for the fact that certain processes we cannot incorporate too many people in, simply because we can't find them, and likely will not be able to find them in the foreseeable future. And then, of course, with COVID, we also focused a lot on commerce and service. However, there are many aspects, and as I said, I would recommend, as we go back and now look at, what is our strategy? So ask yourself, what is your strategy as an organization, and how prominent is digital in that strategy? And then, can you articulate where you stand? Can you develop a common language for what is digitalization? And then ensure that you work towards the next goal, the next level of maturity when it comes to digitalization. Now, I believe that there are 5 areas that really will dominate what we do in addition to the ones that we are already seeing. Now, we don't have time to cover all 5, but let me just give you a sense of what they are. I believe first that there is an emerging category of software tools that allow us to start our product development and our platform development basically from scratch, and develop new products and services that start with the development of the digital environment. Because keep in mind, the last 20 years, digital has always been an afterthought. It was the last in the chain of developing something. When we developed a product, it was a physical product. Let's take a car. You develop a car, and then you think about what software needs to go into the dashboard, and you develop that, and then you launch the car. That's not what car manufacturers are starting to do now. It is not what pharmaceutical companies are starting to do now. They start with the digital instance, and then they develop the platform, and then following that comes the actual physical product. So there are tools to do this. There's thought processes, there's management structures that need to be put in place for that. The next is solving this question of skills, and that one I will touch on, so I'm not going to talk about it here. Third is, of course, how do we evolve the maturity of our organization so that we can better deal with data and artificial intelligence as a true fabric of everything that is leadership? Because let's be honest, if you ask the average leader or manager in their organization and have them honestly rate their competency level, their skill level when it comes to thinking about data as a business asset, thinking about artificial intelligence as an opportunity to turn value of that in an ethical manner, then we would likely see most leaders, including myself, rate ourselves very low. And that, if you go back to the first quote, or data is the oil of the 21st century, and analytics and artificial intelligence is the combustion engine, then we have to change leadership competencies in the organization in order to be prepared for this next stage of digitalization. Business model changes is, of course, the other thing that we need to now build into the fabric of what it means to be a leader. And the fifth one is around organization skills and leadership. Now, I'm going to go into depth on two of them. The reverse digital pyramid, and I know most of you are going to say, what is that? And I'll explain. And then, of course, what is actually the competencies that you need as we go into this next phase of digitalization? And I will outline you a model called 10+3 that outlines what I believe are the key critical competencies that need to be present in every organization to succeed in this next phase. Andre started briefly mentioning this. In the 1980s, I worked in an airline company called Scandinavian Airline Systems. It was actually not in the airline I worked in the hotel division, because back then it was, when you were an airline, it was cool also to own hotels. Ultimately, these days, most airlines are challenged running the airline, and certainly not their fault necessarily. But SAS had a very inspirational leader called Jan Carlson. And Jan Carlson, a Swedish gentleman, wrote a book that's called Tearing the Pyramids Down. Because Jan Carlson's thought was that the moments of truth, of which he said there are 50,000 moments of truth every day back then in SAS, and that is when the an employee touches and talks to a customer. That is true. Let's now fast forward to 2022, and then let's talk about our digital moments of truth. Because now we have millions of digital moments of truth that do involve human beings. And when we talk about digitalization, I would encourage us to kind of take that pyramid on the left, which has been our focus in what I would call the pre-pandemic digitalization, which has all been about, it's the large digital infrastructure projects. We had the large signature projects of digitalization. It was, let's build a website environment that starts to look at our products in a different way. Let's perhaps start to build a massive product that we're using. So digitalization was top-down driven. Digitalization was top-down driven. What if we take Jan Carlsson's message to heart, his message about 50,000 moments of truth when the employee touches the customer, and look at the millions of digital moments of truth that happen as a result of us working with customers. Now, there are no tools for that. There is the obvious, which is, of course, we need to prepare employees across organizations for this, but say, what if we actually allowed employees in a more decentral manner to be able to actually configure the products, the digital products that they work with, so that they can work better with the customer, and have them configure it, so that we take the combination of low code, no code tools combined with artificial intelligence that supports the employee, combined with the intelligent RPA environments that are emerging, and the fact that we have an enormous number of digital native frontline employees and managers, and mush that all together in a world that says we will give creativity an opportunity at the digital moments of truth between the employee and the customer, that they can configure this, and thereby also likely solve the fact that we don't have enough developers. Because we will allow individuals to do something like this. Obviously, yes, under an architecture. Obviously, yes, governed by a security-based environment, but the tools are emerging. There is not one environment, but there will be. And as a combination of these different things, they present a possible digital empowerment, or digital kaizen, to use a Japanese term for the same, that actually drives the next digital wave. So that, I think, will be something that we will all work on over the next 5 years. The second thing that we have to work on is that of thinking about, what is it we need in our organization? What is leadership in the digital age? And this has been a topic that has preoccupied me a lot. And I think I've finally gotten it down to also one slide. And obviously we can't go through all of the different aspects here. So I've grouped it in 4 different groups. I believe in terms of really having every manager on board, and therefore deeming that our maturity level from a digital leadership competencies perspective is high, we would need to have people that are digital visionaries, not 1 or 2 people, not the chief digital officer, every manager. We would need to have people who think about those digital moments of truth with an end customer focus. And we would have to have people that understand, how do I create an ecosystem with partners and suppliers and particular groups, even my competitors. That's what I call the strategy pillar of competencies required. The second one are the technology ones. Can every manager sit down and say, what is it that technology can do? And here's what I suggest it should do. Do they really understand the concept, not of the technical aspect of it, but the concept, the business concept of IT orchestration? Do they understand what data-driven means? Those are the technology aspects of the competencies that need to be present. And then we also would need to have a set of organizational competencies around digitalization. We need to evolve this aspect of ambidextrous. It's called two-speed IT by some people. Gartner has terminology for this, but it is in essence that right brain, left brain aspect of being able to deal with complexity? Do we have the right agile mindset across all managers? Are they competency aware? Do they know what competencies we need 2 years from now and 3 years from now, not just trying, and that is really hard, to address the competencies required for today? And then, do we understand the workplace environment of the future, which is very different? We were tested during COVID, but we did emergency measures of this. And in essence, we need to perhaps now think about, how do we make this sustainable? How do we make it a mindset? How do we make it a competency within all managers, not just in IT, all managers across the organization? And then there are 3 leadership competencies that I would suggest you consider. Multiplicity leadership, the ability to handle multiple bottom lines, for example. We as leaders are used to actually thinking about things in financial terms. So we think about a P&L, we think about our budget, but what about also thinking about the sustainability aspect of a budget? So basically conforming to the UN goals when it comes to sustainability, or the diversity aspect of things in organization. That's multiplicity leadership. We need people that really understand tech and data. They can sit there with storytelling and be able to create a vision of something that nobody has ever seen. That is a good leader. Because remember, there are an infinite set of possibilities with technology that your organization could deploy. So therefore, what you deploy doesn't exist. Stop looking for use cases and instead develop a mindset that is open and can tell stories about the things that do not exist today, but could be beneficial. And then, of course, last but not least, the requirement for transformational leadership as an organizational capability. I would encourage you to think a little bit about this from a perspective of benchmarking yourself in terms of where you are. And if I just go back, I would choose 2 or 3 of these, because you can't get your organization to be good at all 13 at the same time. So which of these really matter in the next stage of digitalization of your organization? And then I would be very programmatic and very specific on how I develop all managers, and for that matter of fact, all people in your organization, so that they actually have the skill set needed. I want you to take 3 things from this. First, we made mistakes in digitalization's first phase, the pre-COVID. COVID taught us certain things, but now I really want you to assess what generation of digitalization you're on, what level of maturity are you, and what is your next stage, and develop a common language for what that is across your entire leadership team, and then ultimately across all managers. I talked about 5 areas of the new strategy for what is digital. The one thing I would like you really to take away from this, stop talking about a digital strategy. You have a strategy that incorporates digital. It may in fact be all digital, but it is your company's strategy and there is only one. And then last but not least, our work now, because digitalization now becomes hard. We're at the hard part, and therefore start to focus on what are the right competencies that I need across all managers and leaders as we move forward. And with that, as I always say, may the digital force be with you in whatever you do.